Welcome to my woodshop, and welcome to my series of videos on the basic and safe use of the tools inside of the woodshop. In this video, we're going to be covering the table saw, which is the primary workhorse tool of most wood shops. I'm going to be going over the basic cuts, the rip cut, the cross cut, and also the dado cut. We'll talk about the things that you can do to adjust your table saw, and we'll talk about the basic safety involved. I might even have a personal story there. To begin with, let's talk about the things that you can do to adjust your table saw. The first item that you can adjust is this fence. And with most fences, there's a locking mechanism in the front. I simply pull up, and you'll have to ignore my handle, which is bent from a move. And then you can slide it back and forth and lock it back into place. You can even lift it up and put it on the other side of the blade if the cut that you're working on requires that. Important thing to keep in mind is the distance between the blade and the fence, as that's the size of your cut. Mine and several others have indications of what that size is here, but you don't need it. If you have a tape measure, you can simply measure, make small adjustments, and lock it back into place. The next adjustment that you can make is the tilt of the blade. And that's done in most table saws by a dial on the side of the blade itself. You move this and it tips it over. Now the front here actually has an indication of how many degrees I've set my angle to. But you can always use another tool to make sure that you're getting the angle that you want. One thing to keep in mind is that the guard that goes around the blade here might be difficult to take in and out while the blade itself is tipped. So if you need to make any changes, do it while the blade is straight and then tip your blade for your cut. We can also adjust the height of the blade, and that is typically done with the dial at the front of the saw. As you can see, you twist this and it moves up. You go in the other direction and it goes back down. So what is the safest height to keep any cut? Well, typically what you're looking for is about 1/4 to 1/2 inch above the material that you're going to cut. The higher up you go, the more surface area you have on the board and the better chance you have of binding. So it's good to keep it down low. But if you go too low, if there's any sort of wiggle in it as you're pushing it through, you may not clear a portion of the material that you're cutting, and you could run into your riving knife. So keeping it about 1/4 to 1/2 inch above the material you're cutting is the target you're usually looking for. Now let's talk about some of the safety mechanisms that you can use with your saw. You've probably noticed that I have this guard over my blade. They make different kinds of these guards, and I like this particular one quite a bit. And it comes from long experience. Now, it's probably difficult to see, but this particular digit of mine, my left thumb, I almost lost it about 20 years ago in an accident with the table saw. And the reason for that was I was making a cut for a hardwood floor, and after I had pushed the material through, I decided to reach over and grab that material, something I'd done many times, but I wasn't paying as close enough attention as I should have, and I caught my thumb on the top of that blade. And rather than go into detail, let me just say that it can be life-altering to have something like that happen to you, and thus I think it's a good idea to invest in a little bit of safety equipment. Now, you may not have a blade cover to go over your table saw, that's fine. At a very minimum, I think you should install one of these back here, which is the riving knife. Not all of them are made to have a blade cover attached to them, but the riving knife's job is very important. When you're cutting a piece of material as it goes through the saw, the biggest case where you can have an accident other than touching the saw yourself is if the material is to twist in there a little bit, bind against the blade, and then kick back at you. And sometimes that kickback happens directly, but sometimes it goes up towards you as well. And the riving knife helps by having a guard against that particular twist of the material so it can't happen as easily. So I absolutely recommend putting those in. I'll put a few pictures here in the video of different saws with the riving knives installed so you can get a sense of what those look like. This guard is another one. The guard that you use is dependent on the blade that you use, and it should come up very tight up against the blade itself. So if you're making a different kind of cut with a different kind of blade, you may either have to purchase or make this guard that will go with it. The reason that this adds safety to your tool is that it keeps material from sinking down on the sides and binding up against that blade. One last bit of safety that we should go over is the push stick. Now it's required that table saws come with these, but you can lose them. This is the one that came with my saw. They come in different shapes and sizes. And this is important because you don't want to get your hand too close to the blade, but sometimes you might be making a cut that is that close. Now if you're going to push through material and your hand isn't going to go over this guard, you're probably fine without the push stick. But if you're making a cut more like this, it's fine to use your hand to a point, but once you get close to that point, it's best to switch over and push it through with the guard instead, keeping your hand well away from the blade. All right, so let's see those adjustments in action as we make a rip cut. Now a rip cut is the cut that goes along the direction of the wood grain. And it's your long cut like this. In this case, I want to remove all of this bark material that's on this board, which means at its narrowest point, I want to go to 4.5 inches. So let's move our fence over 4.5 inches like that. It's a thinner board, so I'm going to bring the level down to there, and then I'm going to put my safety gear on. And once I have all of the safety gear on, I'm also going to start up the vacuum and turn this on, and it's going to be pretty noisy. So we'll leave it to voice over me if there's anything else to say. The board that you cut on the table saw should be prepared in advance. It should have nice flat sides both against the table and against the fence. I prepared this particular board on the jointer, and you can see that video in the series. Your eyes should be paying attention to both the blade and the fence. And while most of your pressure is pushing it against the blade, you can also be putting a little bit of pressure on that board to make sure that it's following the fence. So you may have noticed I waited until the blade was turned off before I actually took my material away. When I'm working on a lot of boards at a time, I don't always do that, mostly because I have this guard here to protect me. I can now reach over and know that, unlike 20 years ago, I'm not going to tap my thumb on that blade. Now this particular saw has an additional safety mechanism. It's a saw stop, and it's quite famous for this. But there's actually an electronic sensor that goes through the blade itself, and it detects whether there's something that has a current like my fingers. If they were to touch it, that saw would drop immediately before it could do me much damage. Not every saw has that, I know, and so you still have to look out for it. The very last safety feature that I'd like to mention is the switch itself, the on-off switch. This one is a paddle switch, and it's done very intentionally so that if I'm running into any trouble, I don't even have to reach over. My knee can just tap it, and we can turn the saw off. If you're running into any sort of problem that you encounter that you're not expecting, it's not pushing through as easily for you as you'd like, or you think something's just a little bit off and you're nervous about it, go ahead and switch that off. Take a look at it with the blade no longer spinning, see if you can adjust and start a new cut, or bring someone over to take a look at it for you who has a little more experience. That's the basic safety mechanisms behind a saw. Let's show you some more cuts. So let's say that you want to cut a board this way, which is across the grain rather than along the grain in the rip cut that we've already done. When you want to cut it this way, we call that a cross cut. And it's a dangerous thing to do if you were to simply try and do this by hand the way you would with a rip cut. And the reason for that is you can see that there's a lot of material here to move back and forth, and not a lot of it is up against your fence. That means when you're pushing it through, especially if you're using two hands, there's more of a tendency for it to twist and for it to bind in the blade before it gets back to the riving knife. Because of that, we want to use more guides than we have available with the fence. Now, most table saws come with a miter gauge like this. It simply inserts into these slots that you have on the two sides of your blade, and you can take it up against a flat edge of a board and push it through. If you were to do that, you do want to make sure that the gauge itself is square to the blade, and mine is set that way, but it's worth checking every few times you use it. It's also sometimes a good idea not to set your fence exactly where you want that cut to occur. Either mark it and compare it to the blade itself, or you can actually just use a stop, clamp that to your fence, but have it back further than the blade so that you start with it up against the fence, but by the time you're making your cut, it's free of that. So there is no binding over here on this other side. You're simply holding it in place by holding it up against your miter gauge. Oftentimes an even better approach for this is to not use the miter gauge at all, but instead to use something like this. This is a crosscut sled, and they have a lot of different shapes and sizes, and there's lots of videos you can go and check out to see how they work. But they work similar to the miter in that they fit into the grooves, and you can then take your material, have it supported on both sides, and have it cut through. This one comes with a gauge so that I can make the same size cut over and over again. That is the safe way to make a cross cut using a table saw. The final cut type that I'd like to go over with you requires making a change to the blade. And that cut is the dado. Now, a dado uses a specific kind of blade to try and make it so that you can cut a wider cut inside of your material, and usually so that you're not cutting all the way through the material. Take, for instance, this piece of a drawer. It has rabbets at the end, which are a dado cut. They're just called rabbets because they are at the end, and a dado down the bottom here, which is where I insert the base of that particular drawer. Both of those are done with the same type of blade. There are two kinds of dado blades that are most common. One is what is sometimes referred to as a wobbly dado, or in this case, it's called a dial dado. And you can stick this onto your table saw and twist this to make an adjustment so that as the blade is spinning, it's actually wobbling back and forth a little bit, and based on how much you adjust it, it changes the width of the cut. I don't actually like that kind of dado very much. Instead, I like to use the stackable dado. And if you watch my videos, you'll see me use this quite a bit. The way the stacking dado works is that it has, in this case, a minimum cut size of 1/4 inch. And that 1/4 inch is obtained by stacking these two outside plates together. They're 1/8 inch cut each, and offsetting the blades so that they fit in between each other. That would give you 1/4 inch. If you need more material than that cut out, you simply stack between these two blades these what are called chipper blades. Now, most of these are 1/8 inch, so when I stack them together, I go from 1/4 inch and I add one, and I get 3/8 inch. I add another, I'll get 1/2 inch. There are some different sizes in here so that you can make adjustments by 1/16 or a 32nd. And if you need to get even more finely tuned than that, there are very thin discs that you can put in between the chippers that allow you to get just that little bit extra space. So let me show you on this table saw how a blade is changed. Now keep in mind that as I change this blade, that different table saws have different mechanisms for doing this, but they do tend to work on the same principle. What we're going to attempt to do here is to change out this ripping cut blade for this 1/2 inch dado stack. We begin by taking out the guard. You see that I have another guard that I use for my dado stacks that is shorter in its length here, but has the width from the dado cuts from earlier that I've done. And we're also going to have to take out our riving knife and blade guard. Now when we do dado cuts, we actually often cannot use a riving knife, so we're just going to put that aside. Now in order to change the blade, you're going to need a couple of these. These will be specific to your saw, and generally they're attached to your saw somewhere. These sit on the side of the left side of mine. So we want to use the open end to get onto the arbor here. You see that's on. And we want to use the closed end to get onto the arbor nut down here. Now important, I've already turned this table saw off. There is no way that I can bump a switch and have the motor start spinning on me. Give it a little tug like that, and that loosens the arbor bolt down here, the arbor nut on the bolt. Bring that out. And this is the arbor washer. Now the diameter of this arbor will determine what kind of blades you can support. And also the length will determine what kind of blades you can support. Some smaller table saws won't let you put a full 3/4 inch dado on there. If it won't fit the washer and the nut, don't do it. There is also a special kind of mechanism on the saw stop that I have to do when I change the size of blades. So I first take out this pin and then this brake cartridge, which is designed for 10-inch blades. The dado is an 8-inch blade, and you can see that this one sticks up further and is wider because they know for 8-inch blades you're generally using a dado. Now the order that we put these blades in is important. So we start with an outside blade so that the blade tips are spinning towards you. You don't want to do it that way. The blade tips go this way. And for those of you who are saw stop owners, make sure that there is a little bit of a gap in between the brake and the blade. Then we put in 2 chippers. Again, when you're putting the chippers in, the blade part needs to be facing towards you so it spins towards you. And then the outside arbor washer, arbor nut, tighten it, get that out of the way, and put in our guard. That's how you change the blade. That is now a 1/2 inch blade ready to do material cuts. Now what about the depth? The most common cut for me to make is to have a 1/4 inch depth, and I use these gauges for that. These are great little gauges. This is 1/4 inch from the bottom blades here, has 1/4 inch here, and it has 1/4 inch there. For these, I like to run them right there, do it so the tip of the blade just hits. And I know I've got 1/4 inch. One last consideration when you're setting up for your cut is whether or not you're going to be making a rabbet type cut or a straight dado down the middle. And a rabbet is when you make that cut right up against the edge. If you're going to do that, you don't really want to bring your fence in direct contact with the blade to give you that edge. You're going to mess up your fence. So what we use instead is what we call a sacrificial fence, which is usually just a nice straight board. You can go ahead and bring that up against the fence, and then I use clamps to make sure that it's held up against there very well, and make my adjustments until I'm up against the blade but not deflecting the blade in any way when I clamp it down. One important difference with the dado cut compared to the 2 previous cuts is that you have to apply a constant pressure down very near where the blade is. Fortunately, it is also a rather safe cut up until you get to the very end, where you need to watch that your fingers are clearing the blade. And that's really all there is to it. That's 3 different cuts, and very versatile cuts on the table saw. Those 3 cuts will get you through 95+%, even as an experienced woodworker, of the use cases that you have for a table saw. I hope you've enjoyed the information in this video, and it will help you to learn how to use this tool effectively for your own projects. Enjoy making those projects. Enjoy your work in the wood shop. And if you did find some use in this video, please take a look out for my other videos that show the safe and basic use of the tools around the wood shop. Have fun making sawdust, and we'll see you in a future video.